Beacon Press Audio presents The Young Crusaders, the untold story of the children and teenagers who galvanized the civil rights movement by V.P. Franklin. This audiobook is narrated by Jonathan Horne, published by Beacon Press Audio, 2020. Introduction. Children and Teenagers, Foot Soldiers for Democracy. The day we were arrested, one of the Negro trustees sneaked us a newspaper. We discovered that over 400 high school students had also been arrested. We were so glad we sang freedom songs for an hour or so. Anne Moody, 1968. It may surprise many readers to learn that the largest civil rights demonstration in United States history was not the August 1963 March on Washington, but the system-wide school boycott in New York City on February 3, 1964, when over 360,000 elementary and secondary school students went on strike and thousands attended the freedom schools opened throughout the city. Civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, who had organized the March on Washington, was recruited by local leaders to head up the mobilization for the Freedom Day protests in New York City. The day after the strike, Rustin declared, "This was the largest civil rights protest in the nation's history." It was the participation of hundreds of thousands of African American, Puerto Rican, and white children and teenagers in the public school boycotts in New York, Boston, Chicago, and other cities in the 1960s that made them successful. Indeed, children and teenagers were on the front lines at nonviolent protests and demonstrations throughout the 1950s and 60s. But their major contributions to civil rights activism has generally gone unacknowledged. We have witnessed children and teenagers taking center stage in 21st century protests and demonstrations aimed at arresting the deterioration in our physical environment and ending the unnecessary slaughter associated with gun violence. Yet decades earlier, children and teenagers often took the lead in challenging the disparities in educational resources between rich and poor, black and white public schools, opposing Jim Crow practices in public accommodations, and protesting the unprovoked violence carried out by law enforcement officials. When civil rights organizers came to town to recruit participants in nonviolent direct action campaigns to challenge racially discriminatory practices, children and teenagers were often the first ones to show up on the picket lines in large numbers, and oftentimes they were attacked, brutalized, and arrested by the police. Anne Moody was born in Centerville in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, in 1940. And before graduating from Tougaloo College in 1964, she worked as a civil rights organizer for the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. In May 1963, Moody was sent to Jackson, Mississippi, to work with SNCC's Robert Paris Moses and other civil rights organizers in conducting workshops where potential demonstrators, high school and college students mostly, were taught to protect themselves. Moody's Coming of Age in Mississippi, published in 1968, became a bestseller, especially after it was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review by Massachusetts Senator Edward Ted Kennedy. The book soon became a classic autobiographical account and brilliant narrative, not just of black life in the Deep South in the first half of the 20th century, but also of the civil rights campaigns mounted there and her work in the movement. In June 1963, Moody and 4 others from Tougaloo decided to stage a sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Jackson. As the black and white protesters sat there for several hours, angry whites gathered and started smearing them with ketchup, mustard, sugar, and everything on the counter. Adam D. Beitel, president of Tougaloo College, soon arrived and was finally able to convince the policemen who were standing around outside to allow him to lead the protesters out of Woolworth's. When we got outside, The policemen formed a single line that blocked the mob from us. However, they were allowed to throw at us anything they had collected. The sit-in led to a rally that night at the Pearl Street Church, attended by hundreds of adults and teenagers, where the Woolworths sit-inners were introduced by Medgar Evers, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP leader for the state of Mississippi. Plans were made for a pray-in at the local post office the next day. 14 demonstrators, 7 blacks and 7 whites, managed to make it inside. But outside, the whites standing there had murder in their eyes, and the police came and arrested protesters. The same day, Moody and the others were taken to jail. The students at all-black Lanier High School started singing freedom songs in the cafeteria during their lunch hour. When the bell rang to return to class, they just kept singing. The principal, fearing a riot, panicked and called in the police, who brought dogs and then turned them loose. The students fought them off for a while, and mothers who arrived at the scene and saw what was happening joined in fighting off the dogs. They had begun to throw bricks, rocks, and bottles. Several students and their mothers were arrested. The day after that unprovoked attack, over 400 students from Lanier, Gem Hill, and Brinkley High Schools gathered at the church on Ferris Street. SNCC, CORE, and NAACP Youth Council organizers briefly instructed the teenagers on how to protect themselves when attacked, and then led them into the street. After marching 2 blocks, they were met by a squadron of police who ordered the teenagers to disperse. When they refused, they were arrested and herded into paddy wagons, canvas-covered trucks, and garbage trucks. Those moving too slowly were jabbed with rifles. The police brought dogs, but they were not used. The high school students were taken to the fairgrounds and held there. Moody and other civil rights workers also got themselves arrested, hoping to join the teenagers at the fairgrounds, but these professional agitators were kept at the city jail. While the teenagers were being held, mass protest rallies took place every night in Jackson, and every day that week, people were taken to jail. Despite court injunctions prohibiting street demonstrations, they continued, and even NAACP officers Roy Wilkins and Medgar Evers were arrested on the picket line in front of Woolworths. In and out of jail several times, Moody was again arrested during this protest, and this time, she was taken to the fairgrounds where the high school students were being held. As the place where cattle were held and then auctioned off during the annual state fair, the fairgrounds were enclosed in barbed wire. It reminded me of a concentration camp. I imagined myself in Nazi Germany, the policemen Nazi soldiers. There were still about 150 high school girls there. It was hot and sticky, and girls were walking around half-dressed all the time. The food provided was not fit for human consumption. The sight of it nauseated me. Over the next few days, many were taken from the fairgrounds sick from hunger. Then, on June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers was shot outside his home and later died. The next day, when people learned of the shooting, huge demonstrations were mounted in the streets of Jackson. Moody was arrested again, and the police brought dogs, billy clubs, and fire trucks and used hoses to disperse the crowds. Protesters and bystanders who threw bottles, rocks, and other debris at the police were being arrested. Then, John Doerr stepped out from the police barricade and identified himself as being from the U.S. Department of Justice. He came over and talked with the demonstrators, suggesting this wasn't the way to respond to Evers' death. Several ministers present agreed and started asking people to return to their homes, and soon the crowd dispersed. The protests in Jackson, Mississippi, in which Ann Moody participated and described in detail in her celebrated autobiography, included many of the elements that would characterize children and teenagers' contributions to civil rights activism before and after 1963. Prior to 1963 and the events in Jackson, young people in the NAACP youth councils and other civil rights groups participated in nonviolent direct action campaigns
Sample complete. Ready to continue?